Hey guys, hey guys, welcome back to another episode. My name's Ed Thorne. In this series we are going to be talking about EQ, what it is, the basics of it and how we can use it to make our mixes sound awesome. This is going to be a 4-part series. In this episode today we're going to talk about how to use EQ in general, the basics of it and how to apply it to an overall mix. In part 2 we're going to be talking about vocal EQ. In part 3 we're going to be talking about EQ for guitars and bass. And finally in part 4 we're going to be talking about applying EQ to the drums. If this sounds like something you're interested in, subscribe below so you don't miss the rest of these episodes. Let's get into this video right now. So what is equalization, or EQ as it is more commonly known as? Equalization is the process of balancing and adjusting the energy of a specific range of frequencies in an electronic signal. Or in more usable terms, adjusting how something sounds, whether it be a microphone, a PA system or a car stereo. We can adjust the bass, whether something's boxy or not, whether there's too much sibilance or whether something sounds harsh. Most car and home stereos will have basic EQ filters to enable the user to adjust the bass and the treble. These, however, will be quite wide filters and therefore won't enable the user too much control. In a live music setting, EQ can be used to control feedback by adjusting the equalization of the monitors, the front of house system and individual microphones. There are two types of EQ. There is subtractive, where we take away volume at certain frequencies, and additive, where we add volume to certain frequencies. Both have a use and we'll discuss how and why and where these different techniques are applied. As with anything in music, there are no fixed rules to this. One thing will work for you, one thing will work for someone else. It depends on the style, the room, the artist, the performance, the microphones. It depends on a lot of aspects, but what works for you, works for you. That's the beauty of music. With no fixed rules in mind, though, there are some common suggestions to help you along your way on the different instruments, and we're going to discuss those in this series. Let's dive into the computer so we can talk about these principles in action and see how they can work for us in our home studio. Alright, so there's many types of EQ that producers and sound engineers will use, but the main two are graphic EQs and parametric EQs. A graphic EQ will typically have 15 or 31 faders that will enable the user to adjust the volume of a specific frequency range plus 12 or minus 12 decibels. Each fader will have a linear filter attached to it, so it can only adjust that one specific frequency range. As you can see in the computer here, I have a graphic EQ native to Logic, and there's 10 bands of EQ attenuation here. Let's hear how this sounds in action so you can hear how the different faders adjust the sound of the track. The background track is the second song off my coming album called I Wish. Let's hear how it sounds. So I've ignored 31 and 63 Hertz just because I don't think on most people's listening devices that's going to translate very well. They're a bit too low in the frequency spectrum for headphones and things like that, and certainly phone speakers. But just with those two, 125 and 250, by boosting each one of those frequency ranges, you get an idea of how that affects the track. Let's keep going up the frequency range so you can get an idea of how they affect the sound. So personally, I think it's most obvious when you're affecting 4K, 125 and 250. A lot of speakers and headphones aren't going to go up to 16K, so you might not have heard that. But you get a lot of the top end on the hi-hats there. I've purposefully not left any vocals on this track, partly because they're not finished and I don't want to release those until the final track is finished. Moving on, let's talk about the next type of EQ, arguably the main type of EQ, which is parametric EQ. On the screen now we have a parametric EQ, again one native to Logic. It's great, I use it on nearly everything, and if I don't end up using it in the final mix because I prefer how another plugin sounds, it's a very good way to identify where the problematic frequencies are. You'll notice on this EQ there are some different signs across the top. Let's go from left to right. The left one here is what we call a high pass filter. And what that does is that filters anything above a certain frequency. So you might think, why is it not called a low pass filter? I certainly did when I started, because it's filtering off everything below it, but it's called a high pass filter. And conversely, at the other end of the spectrum, there is a low pass filter, which filters everything below that threshold, as you can see here. So let's hear how the low pass filter sounds in action. So what that's doing is filtering out all the frequencies in the signal below this red line here. And you could really hear the effect of that and how that was changing the sound of the overall mix the further up the frequency range we went. Let's try that again from the top end. So we're getting very boxy there, not very little clarity. So throughout this series of videos, we'll talk about how this is useful and why and where we would use these applications. So the next icon in is a low pass shelf. We also have a high pass shelf, and they look like this. So what that is boosting everything equally above or below the point at which you set it. What the high and low pass filters were doing was filtering everything absolutely out of the mix. What these do is enable us just to boost or reduce an even amount of the signal below or above a certain point. So for example, if we wanted all the bass above 100 Hz boosting, we'd set this to 100 Hz and boost all of it. And as you can see, it's a flat shelf, a boosting of all the signal below 100 Hz. So using the car stereo reference, a lot of the top end will be boosted from about 1K, and the bottom end will be reduced or boosted from, I would have thought, 500 and below. For example, these are very broad filters, and we can shape the sound, but we can't necessarily get as surgical or as accurate as we may need to in a mix. So moving on to these icons here, this is where a parametric EQ really comes into its own and is quite a powerful tool. We can adjust these as high as we want and as wide as we want, but also as narrowly as we want as well, so we can be really accurate. So what I was doing there, which is what makes the parametric EQ so powerful, is I was sweeping across the whole frequency spectrum. And this enables you to hear where there's particularly hot, troublesome frequencies. Let's do that again, and when I find one that I don't like, I'm going to reduce it as well, so you can hear how that affects the mix. And the beauty of a tool like this is once I've identified where the troublesome frequencies are, I don't need to mess around with the cue point and I'm trying to reduce it. By doing that, I may lose the exact frequency that I found that I don't like. I can leave it up there and I can simply drag this decibel icon here and reduce it or boost it as much as I like. So parametric EQs are really powerful, and engineers will use these on pretty much every instrument at some point to really clear up a mix. On the screen now we have another parametric EQ, but this one has dials and is sweepable. It's a little bit more by ear. You can't quite visualize it as much as you can on the parametric EQ, but you'll get the idea of boosting and reducing frequencies. The theory is the same. This is just a different looking plugin. This is actually based on a hardware unit. Before digital plugins, hardware units, of which this is modeled on one, was how people would attenuate and filter the sound signal. So that's an overview of what EQ is and should hopefully get you started in your mixers. What I would suggest is experimenting, as I did, sliding the cue point across the screen, just to tune your ears into what frequencies are where and how different parts of the frequency spectrum sound. If you've liked this video and if you've got value out of this video, please subscribe, hit that like button. It really does help and I massively appreciate it. And stick around for part 2, where we'll be talking more in depth about equalizing vocals.